Hello, everyone. Today, let's talk about some of the problems in the contemporary world, perhaps some of the solutions as well. One of the difficulties in today's world is economics. Back in the days following World War I, the United States retreated into isolationism. And the Congress decided that they would put up tariff barriers to restrict trade from overseas. It was thought that this would strengthen American businesses and allow them to develop to be the strongest businesses in the world. It did not happen. American businesses did develop, but others developed a competitive edge over some of the American businesses. And eventually, America found that their goods were not as good as in other places. Truly, worldwide competition is good for everyone. In addition to that, with the decrease in trade, we had good times at home for a little while, but then eventually it led to bad times, and we call those bad times the Great Depression. There were other causes of the Great Depression, including overspeculation in the markets, in the stock markets. And there was drought, which caused terrible problems within the agricultural realm. But government policies were also part of the problem, and they exacerbated the difficulties within the United States during this terrible time. The initial approach done by President Hoover was what is called trickle-down economics. He gave money at the top, gave it to the businesses, cut taxes, and tried other things to try and encourage them to spend more money. But the businesses, the companies, were afraid. They wanted to protect their profits as long as they could, and therefore they didn't spend the money, they didn't pass it on, they just simply held it as profits. When that happened, it made the entire situation worse, and therefore President Hoover's economic policies were a failure. President Roosevelt took the opposite approach. He said, let's spend the money, let's put it into the economy, let's make work for people. And to some extent, these policies were successful. They did not bring us out of the Depression. That, sadly, was caused by revving up of the economy because of World War II. But Roosevelt's policies did give some relief to individuals, and therefore they accelerated the movement out of the depths of the Depression, although they didn't complete the Depression. One of the problems with Roosevelt's policies, however, was that the spending put the United States into some economic peril again. Nevertheless, those policies have continued more or less unabated to the present day. We see in the United States many of the programs initiated by President Roosevelt, such as Social Security, and there is some worry that those programs are taking so much money that they will eventually die. It appears that the government is going to have to resolve some of the problems of how to handle the economy of the United States. There have been further problems. A savings bank scandal, the dot-com bubble, problems with companies like Enron and AIG, who should have failed, but in the case of AIG, were not allowed to fail, and banks and their over-speculation on the housing market and how that has driven the housing market into the doldrums. These are all difficulties that a free market economy has to struggle with because, frankly, there is some greed that takes over in free market situations, and sometimes that greed is so excessive that government intervention appears to be needed. President Obama's approach has been largely like Roosevelt's. The Republicans, who have regained control of the House of Representatives, as I sit here, are fighting against some of Obama's spending policies And surely they must compromise. They must come to some kind of an agreement where money can be pumped into the economy, but not at at a rate that is so high as to be unsustainable and detrimental to our future. We might ask ourselves, are economic cycles inevitable in a free market economy? I don't know how to answer that. It may be so. But it may be that as we become a little self-interested, that is less self-interested, we may find that other things take precedence. Maybe it will be an improvement of the world's environment, or a struggling for peace, or better economic survival with a little less thought on profits and a little more thought on social and environmental issues. Maybe that we get enough profits and that we are driven by other factors. All of those are being tried. Who knows what will happen? But surely there are great problems in the world and they must be solved. Maybe the solution of those problems will help with the economic problems as well. Sometimes people are put into personal and collective difficulties. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust and a psychologist, has given us some interesting food for thought. He said, "Everything can be taken away from a man or a woman but one thing, the last of human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." It is true that our attitude has to be powerful and yet able to be chosen to fit the circumstances. We will have trials. Sometimes we'll have prosperity as an individual and as a group, and we need to be able to make choices. Everyone has trials. That's part of earth life. Those trials bring self-awareness and perhaps growth. Righteousness may actually increase the trials because others will ridicule you for your righteousness. But in the end, that righteousness and those trials, if coupled with the right attitude, can bring inner peace. As a group, we can help each other bear our burdens, thus softening the blow. We can become a favored people, if you like, a Zion people, who go throughout the world and try and improve the lives of others. We can go on missions, humanitarian as well as proselytizing, and we can simply raise the level of humanity in this world. Trials sometimes bring a growth in a community. If the community will look at the trials appropriately and learn from them, both as individuals and as groups. We must realize that there is a background against which these trials occur, and we must have control over that background, the background being our own attitudes. So if we have, as Frankl says, control over our attitude as individuals and as a group, we can have peace and we can have group growth. There is a very interesting phenomenon that has occurred in the United States and continues to occur. It is civil rights. The most dominant and obvious of these civil rights struggles was a struggle with the blacks. That struggle began with the importation of black slaves for work in the cotton fields. After the Civil War, they were given freedom, but they were not given equal opportunity. And in the 1960s, men like Martin Luther King Jr. decided that they would lead the blacks into equal opportunity. They were not able to do it on their own, but the federal government decided that they would back these civil rights initiatives. The federal government said that it was the obligation of the government to even move into places where states had refused to allow the federal government access. But it was these very states that had laws that denied civil rights to all people. I remember the time when governors would stand at the door of a school with an axe handle in their hand, refusing to allow admittance to not only black youngsters, but federal troops. That movement resulted in victory for the blacks. Martin Luther King led them in Gandhi-like social protests that were largely successful, winning the hearts and minds of the rest of the American population. We might ask ourselves, has the civil rights issue been resolved? I think that there are still problems, not only for the blacks, but for other minorities in the United States. Since the beginning of our history, people who are inside the United States, even some who are of minority population themselves, have sought to close the door for other groups coming in. And yet it is the very diversity that we find in America that is one of the reasons that we have strength. Another problem has to do with the Cold War and the Vietnamese War. Simultaneously with this disliked war in Vietnam, we had a group of youngsters who decided that they were going to be anti-establishment. They wanted to be free of any governmental intervention. In fact, they wanted to be free of all restraints. Reminds me of abstract art. They didn't want to have any forms at all. They just wanted to go out and do whatever they wanted to do and have that declared to be acceptable. I was a college student during those days, and I remember very well my embarrassment over the way some of the people on my campus acted. I think that it was a typical problem of the time when people acted beneath themselves. They would take possession of a dean's office and then do terribly crude and vicious things. It was simply an embarrassment to the world. Nevertheless, it did show that these people had some independence, some rights, and even though they violated the law and occasionally went to jail, it was a confrontation that perhaps the government needed to understand as well as the people. They fought against the war. It was perhaps within their rights to fight against the war, and so long as they were able to do so peacefully, it was acceptable. Even when they were somewhat unpeaceful, if they were not violent, then at least it was acceptable for a protest. They may have to go to jail, but then Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Showed very clearly that if you protest against laws, part of the punishment is that you go to jail. Eventually, probably, the laws will be changed, but you must have the courage to withstand the punishments that an unjust government or force would exert against you. Sometimes that government is so wrong that the policies result in disaster. I remember when a group of students at a university in Ohio called Kent State decided that they would line up in protest against the Vietnamese War. The National Guard in Ohio was called out, and they lined up against and opposite the student protesters. The students were peaceful, even in some cases taking a stem of a flower and inserting it in the barrel of the rifle of some of the National Guard people. But somewhere in the crowd, either because of being provoked or because of just simply anger, someone fired a shot. And then several shots were fired and several people were killed. It was an embarrassment to the United States that in this land of freedom, we persecuted with death some of those who protested peacefully. Should not have happened. And because of that, the arguments against involvement in Vietnam gained great momentum. Those are problems that we've had in America. Now let me talk to you about one of the successes. And maybe this is a way that we can recognize within ourselves the strength and power of America. The success I'm talking about is the space program. While we began the space program early after World War II, we really accelerated that program with the launching of Sputnik and the embarrassment that Sputnik caused. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, I remember very clearly listening to Sputnik go across and hearing the beep, beep, beep over the radio as it crossed overhead. President Kennedy understood that there was a problem in the United States. The problem was divisiveness. The problem could only be solved by unifying ourselves in a great cause. That great cause turned out to be, in Kennedy's words, the space program, and this is what he said. We choose to go to the moon in this decade. The words were spoken in 1961. And do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. And I remember very clearly, in 1969, within the decade, a man stepped onto the moon. We had succeeded as a nation in accomplishing a great feat. And it was the most technologically challenging thing the country had ever done. Now let's look at some of our problems. The first question that we might ask is, are computers a problem? Most of you will laugh and say, of course not. But I remember very clearly how computers were thought to be a problem because of loss of jobs and perhaps loss of privacy. And maybe we have lost a few jobs and maybe we have lost some privacy. But on the other hand, whole new industries have been created. And some of those people who lost jobs in one industry were successful in migrating to another. And that might be part of what we have to learn. Migration of jobs, learning new skills, evolving, becoming different and better. Here's, however, a funny little story that was written by Gene Ziegler in the style of Dr. Seuss. And it's about computers and some of the problems. If a packet hits a pocket in a socket on a port, and the bus is interrupted at the very last resort, and the access of the memory makes your floppy disk abort, then the socket packet pocket has an error to report. If your cursor finds a menu item followed by a dash, and the double-clicking icon puts your window in the trash, and your data is corrupted because the index doesn't hash, then your situation's hopeless and your system's going to crash. If the label on the cable in the table in your house says the network is connected to the button on your mouse, but your packets want to tunnel to another protocol that's repeatedly rejected by the printer down the hall, and your screen is all distorted by the side effects of Gauss, so your icons in the window are as wavy as a souse, then you may as well reboot and go out with a bang, because sure as I'm your poet, the sucker's going to hang. When the copy of your floppy is getting sloppy in the disk and the macro code instructions cause unnecessary risk, then you'll have to flash the memory and you'll want to RAM your ROM, then quickly turn off the computer and be sure to tell your mom. Kind of fun. Well, in light of the space program and the ability of computers to help us, and new technologies that are daily arriving in the marketplace, what could we do about the issue of the environment? Is it possible that the United States could adopt the environment as the technological area that we need to attack? I don't care, in a way, if the Earth is warming or not. I think that's a false argument. The real argument is, do we need to improve the environment? For whatever reason, whether we believe in warming or not. Let's go after the environment as we went after the space program. Let's make it happen. By doing so, we will teach the rest of the world how to be more environmentally conscious, and we will develop the technology that can be sold to the rest of the world and thus strengthen America. Energy is another area where we could do the same. In fact, energy and the environment are intimately related. We could find a method to develop new energy and then teach the world and sell it to them, thus prospering the world and prospering the United States. A third area, also intimately related, is transportation. Surely we must be able to find better ways to move ourselves around than by burning fossil fuels that pollute the air. Here's a little cartoon that I think clearly illustrates some of those problems. We see wind energy, and then the box says, I'm all for green energy, but those turbines creep me out. They remind me of War of the Worlds or the Tripod books. The other character says, are they unnerving? Says, they are unnerving. I can't shake the feeling that at any moment they'll rumble, crack, boom, crack, boom. Oh no, it's coming this way. Al Gore, you've doomed us all. Run, boom. What now? But who could? Someone has to stop them. Stand aside. It is, of course, Don Quixote, and he is set to tilt against windmills. This cartoon's marvelous for me. Not only does it poke fun at modern technology, but it also brings into our focus the technologies of the past, the concepts of literature. Don Quixote wanted to tilt against windmills. He wanted to bring us into a new and better world, perhaps capturing some of the lessons of the old world, but also letting us understand the new. Robert Poole has said this: some scientists, call them builders, see the world as a place to be explored and manipulated. They trust in the power of human reason and believe that acquiring knowledge and putting it to use are acts of virtue. Others, call them conservers, are less sanguine about human reasoning ability and suspect that unchecked, human manipulation of the environment will lead to disaster. They see nature as something to be protected and to be respectful of, and they consider unrestricted growth and development not just dangerous, but often morally wrong. Hence, we see the two sides of science, technology, and perhaps the world in general. The builders who want to improve the world, the conservers who want to keep the world the way it was. I think that those two groups need to find some way to talk to each other without acrimony. They need to make the world a better place and decide what is the best way to do it. We cannot stay the same, for technology will always exist. People will continue to improve. What we have to do is be able to do it under conditions that all can agree are acceptable. Creativity can solve this impasse, but we must talk to each other. Those who are environmentalists must talk to those who are technologists. They must become of a unified mind, or at least of unified actions. I hope they will. Maybe creativity will help. Thank you.